Welcome, everybody. Excited for a new episode of Catching Up. Hey, Mason. And hey, on my agenda today, I've got a lot of things. One is that it's the fall, it's the start of school, and we're going to talk a little bit about start dates and why are they so different across the United States. We're going to jump a little bit into some reading questions about why aren't we reading as much. And our deep dive, on my end at least, is around teacher shortages because so many people are talking about so many pieces of data around teacher shortages. I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So we're going to dive into teacher shortages for a little bit and talk about the data and what maybe schools can do to prevent attrition of great teachers. What about you, Mason?
This week, I'm doing a little bit of a closer look at the global goals and where we're at on our 2030 time horizon and trajectory, with a specific emphasis on something schools are doing to really advance that agenda. And then additionally, we take a look at a little bit at the neuroscience of identity formation and really making values based judgments. This builds on a couple conversations we've had over the last few episodes. We get to learn about Nate's soccer haircuts a little more. So it's going to be great.
Hey, what did I miss in this educational abyss? Trying to catch up, trying to persist.
I've been hearing this joke recently that if you are an adult male, the only way to keep friends is to start a podcast with them. And I think that's also true to the only way to catch a busy coworker is to start a podcast with them. So I'm grateful that we have this to continue to see each other.
Yeah, no, it is good, and it actually it's cool because it forces me to like collect my thoughts over the last couple of weeks and say, what have I been learning? What am I interested in? What do we think listeners will be interested in? So excited for catching up today. It's been a couple of weeks, and I want to start out by just thinking it's the start of school, and I was really interested in this probably not important fact of when school districts start and what's
Hmm.
the latest and what's the earliest. So I did a quick little research project and found that I think the earliest school district start in the United States this last year was Chandler Unified School District in Arizona, which started on July 16th,
Whoa.
which is crazy.
That's
And
neat.
then I did a little bit more of a deep dive and found that 47% are starting before August 17th, and then only 16% are starting after Labor Day now. So
Hmm.
there's been this shift. And then the other interesting thing is that the earlier starts are more in the southern part of the United States rather than the northern part of the United States. And actually, I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's air conditioning and heat. I think that there's better cooling areas in schools, maybe, but that's just a hypothesis. Let alone when the school day starts, the
Yeah,
school year as well. And some people are ready for it to happen, and some people are saying it's too early, too late. There's a lot of mixed opinions on this. So
totally. Totally. I'm going to do my quick intro. This shares about food, which is important. And at Getting Smart, we write a lot about the SDG global goals. And I was really curious, like, where we're at on those. I feel like we throw them around a lot as if they're just sort of like this thing that we're encroaching on and we're inviting students into solving these problems. But I found a little bit of research on our current status report with a school focus at the end. So we have about 5 years remaining until the 2030 deadline, which was sort of the first landmark for the SDGs. And the SDGs are focused on these 6 core transitions. So that is in food systems, energy access and affordability, digital connectivity, education, employment and social protection, and climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So we have these like huge goals. They're global. That's incredibly hard and complex. 35% of the 137 goals are either on track or showing what they say is moderate progress. So this is kind of within the realm of what's trackable, right? We have 47% that are advancing at an insufficient pace. And then we have 18% that have actually regressed to where we started in 2015. So things that are getting worse. I I think that this is just like a useful portrait to keep in mind as we're talking about things because especially in America and right now we can get so focused on how we're doing, but these are global challenges, they're not national challenges. So the thing that stood out to me about this is on the subject of food. There's 42 measurable time trends within the food world, and 20 of them have moved in a desirable direction since the inception of the SDGs. So that's good news. This is like diet quality, sustainability, etc. But really, school meals are one of the core things driving this charge toward progress.
mm,
There's 170 countries now that are running school meal programs. 16 countries have actually enshrined this right to adequate food for youth within their constitutions. The
wow.
domestic investment is at $48 billion a year. And in the last 2 years, an additional 20 million children have started receiving meals across Africa. So I think when we boil these facts down into this like 35%, whatever, it's so hard to grasp what it means to be successful in a thing. But an additional 20 million children getting school meals in Africa is incredible news and sort of built on this framework of these SDGs and what it means to actually catalyze and mobilize a global force.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes me think of two things. One is sort of the power of sustainable development goals as a sort of a driver, and we often in my prior work we would use SDGs as the guidance for what SDG are you trying to tackle now with this
Right.
particular project or this particular difference making purposeful project. Because you and I have talked a lot about when a lot of our work is individual, how do we make sure we ensure the common good? And SDGs are the sustainable development goals are great common good type experiences. So that's number one, and just also makes me think about the power of schools to do more than just teach. Right? These are
Totally.
wraparounds, like community schools in the United States. Is that they're wraparound services that provide healthcare and provide food and all these kind of things that are really really important that we often don't think about when we think about schools. We don't think about them as places where students go to eat. We think about them as places students go to learn. Yet across the world, like you're insinuating, but also in America, there's many, many students that get breakfast and lunch every single day of the week at their schools. And so that's really powerful work and really important to keep kids well fed so their brains work well and they can learn a lot. So awesome.
Totally.
Yeah, it's interesting. The 2030 deadline is that 5 years remaining, and to see where we are, it's a pretty big effort to continue to track these things. But I appreciate that it's continuing to happen. All right, a couple other things for you, just in my just sort of data gathering mode the last couple of weeks. One is just the PDK did a survey on support for public schools, and I think we're seeing a lot of headlines of this eroding trust for public schools, and they reported 13% support nationally for public schools, and that means they're rating public schools in general with a letter grade that is an A or a B or something like that. So fairly arbitrary, but this idea that public schools are good. But also those respondents would rate their local schools 40% would be in support at that high level. So there's something about, we believe, at least respondents to this poll believe, that while a lot of schools are not good in the United States, it's not our local school. But there's
Hmm.
irony there and actually conflict, because if everybody reports 40%, then that covers the rest of the schools, right?
Right.
And then the other piece was this idea of choice of school alternatives like private schools, and 60% would choose private schools. And the poll is national, so it's not just parents of kids who have students enrolled in schools. It's anyone in general who responded to this survey. So
I see.
there are some biases associated with that. But it did make me think a little bit about, we know that support has been dropping, at least according to polls, and I think as we talk through work at Getting Smart and talk in the landscape, is how do we change this, right? How do we to rebuild confidence in the public sector, rebuild confidence in what students are learning, the outcomes they get? And I think a lot of the work that we do at Getting Smart and a lot of our partners that do work in this area are thinking about this, about how do you redesign school to be an incredible place to go where you're maximizing your learning, you're maximizing your belonging, and you're maximizing your long-term outcomes, whether that's
Yeah.
military or higher education or the workforce. So just paying attention to surveys for what they are, it's interesting. I think we have work to do, considering 90% or plus, more than 90% of students are attending public schools. We need to make sure that the perception of them is really strong, as well as the quality of them inherently. So that's one. And then the second one, and then sort of curious to hear your thoughts on both of these, is this idea of reading. And I was a voracious reader when I was a kid. Actually, I didn't have a TV till middle school, and that's when my brother won one in an art contest. And then we had a little black and white TV that we started watching. 30 minutes of public television a week was my parents' rule. So I was at the library all the time, and I read all the time, and I still read all the time. And the NAEP, National Assessment for Educational Progress, they not only do they sort of assess reading and writing and math, et cetera, but they also ask some survey questions. And over the course of 1984 to 2023, the proportion of 13-year-olds who say that they never or hardly ever read for fun on their own time has nearly quadrupled, from just 8% to 31% over that period of time. And so that really made me think about some other conversations we've been having about, in a world where video and short form video like YouTube Shorts and TikTok are where more and more young people get information, and the scrolling is easy, what happens to books? And how do we get people reading for pleasure? Or am I just being a Luddite? And you know what? They're actually going to be looking at video more, and will books become extinct? And so, Mason, there is the big question today for you.
Well, books becoming well, having just recently published a book, I hope that they don't become extinct. I'm a fellow Luddite in the I read a lot world. It's so okay on the book front. I think it's really tough. I was reading an article, I think it went out in the New Yorker recently, but it was quoting the economist Tyler Cowen, and it was talking about how reading and readership is going down, but the reason to write is going up. Because
Oh, for
Tyler
sure.
Cowen's basically like he's been doing a blog on the marginal revolution for over 20 years. And at this point, he's writing some pieces that people might not be interested in. They're just like about when he was 6. And he's like, someday a bot's going to be trained on me, and I want it to have like a comprehensive view of who I was so it can give accurate responses. So
Mm.
like the inputs of what writing a book does, I think will continue to be beneficial. But on this audience question, I think the second we have like a true like voice and speech native culture, I think books are going to really struggle to keep up. I think that
Yeah.
like if we get into this world of her that everyone's always talking about, where you have
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the sort of smart earpiece, I think that just like the sensory prioritization will shift such that like reading becomes less of a place where you go as like even just like as a this is what I could do with my time. I think one thing that we've talked about maybe before is that like reading is so much more than escaping and it's so much more than learning. It's really this like invitational act of multiple engagements over a long time horizon with the same work. So like you're changing while you're reading a book because you've lived 4 weeks in the time it took you to read Moby Dick or something. So kind of dodged your question. I hope books stay relevant. They're still the best way to bundle information. I have unfortunately not a whole lot of faith that that industry is going to stick around in like the same force of entertainment, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I think we're going to see the percent of students that are not reading outside of school is going to continue to grow. And as those students become adults and then potentially raise their own families, that'll be passed on because
Totally.
when I grew up in a house, there was a lot of books in my house. And so they were always around and we went to the library and things like that. We had the library available. And I don't know what's going to happen, but it feels like the way you describe it is that it's almost inevitable.
Yep.
And how do we prepare for that shift? We are doubling down in the United States on the science of reading, right? So we want people to be literate because people need to be literate, but maybe the base level of literacy is where it stops so that you can read road signs, so you can read legal documents, so you can read whatever the case may be. But reading for pleasure is replaced by other things for pleasure that are other media formats. And so, all right, let's do some deep dives. I wanted to start today with deep dive into sort of teacher shortages because we hear a lot about it. It gets broadcast a lot on sort of mainstream media. And by mainstream media now, by the way, I'm saying anybody who's broadcasting. That could be a single person somewhere, or it could be a news source that's been around for 100 years. So mainstream media to me is things that are out there that people are digesting.
Yep.
And so I was interested in this because people always commonly say, "Oh, we have a teacher shortage challenge," and I believe that. I've heard enough stories and anecdotes, but I wanted to look at the data. So I did some deep dive, and I want to share that with you, and then talk a little bit about how do we address this issue and see what you think. So Learning Policy Institute did some really good surveys, and we'll put it in the show notes about the numbers. And so 48 states plus District of Columbia employed an estimated 365,000 teachers who were not fully certified for their teaching assignments, so undercertified. So that's one data piece there. 31 states plus the DC published data on vacancies showing about 45,000 unfilled teacher positions in this survey. And we have to give that some context. So there's about 3.2 million teachers in public schools in the United States. And so we're talking about 1 to 2%. We'd even go higher, probably 2% because we're only at 31 states. So you have about 2% of vacancy rate, which it doesn't seem a lot in terms of percentage, but when you're dealing with 45,000 teachers, that means there's 45,000 classrooms that don't have the right teacher in that classroom. You either have a paraprofessional, someone who's undercertified, someone who's not trained. It could be a principal, it could be a volunteer, who knows what it is. And so the areas of high need are not particularly surprising. So special education, science, and math have the highest vacancies. And so I started thinking about what's the issue, and there's some intuition I have, but I wanted to verify it with what at least the data was saying. So a couple things are happening. So one is there is a thesis that we're having less and less young people go into the teaching industry. And so enrollment in pre-service between 16-17 and 2021, 27 states have had seen an ongoing enrollment decline of 5% or more. 7 had relatively flat, and 17 states plus DC saw an increase of 5% more. So that's variable. It's not a trend across the country that all undergraduate pre-service training programs or universities are struggling with enrollment. Some absolutely are struggling with enrollment, but the data doesn't suggest that all of them. And that data only went to 2021. If I'd had time to dig further, maybe over the last 4 years, that's changed even more. But the bottom line is we need to recruit more people into the profession for sure. And in order to do that, they have to see that being a teacher is a valuable thing and it is worthwhile in the long run, because a lot of teachers don't spend the entire career in teaching. And so the second thing I looked at was attrition. And less than 20% of teachers in the country leave because of retirement, right?
Whoa.
So only 1 in 5 teachers are moving all the way forward towards retirement and then retiring and leaving the profession. Everybody else is leaving early. And so retention is probably the place where we need to really think about. So that then led me down the rabbit hole of what is it that keeps teachers at schools? If retention is the major issue of getting qualified teachers for every single student in the United States, why do they leave? And so some research by EdNow talked about a couple things that are, I think, obvious. So is there strong mentorship programs for new teachers coming in? Is there professional collaboration? So are there opportunities to collaborate around things that are important to those teachers and around the school and district vision? Can they personalize their professional development? This is a huge one. Too much professional development is a stand and deliver. They go and they get something, but it's not relevant to what they're doing and they're not engaged. So can you create professional development pathways that are personalized? And we've been talking about that with that Ed3 DAO work around Portrait of an Educator in the Age of AI, is we need to have probably AI-supported co-designed professional learning pathways for educators. And then the biggie, which is hard to do in some of these systems, is voice, autonomy, and role in decision-making. And this is about purposeful work in general. Humans like to have some voice, some autonomy, and some role. And often in the system of education, public and private, they don't. They're told what to do, and they go and teach. But in order to address this attrition problem, we have to give them that. So that's an interesting conundrum. Of course, better pay. Only a third think that salary is adequate. When you look at the RAND study, did a State of American Teacher Survey in 2024, and only a third think that salary is adequate. And I guess the last thing I would say is that how do we rethink teacher models? And so you and I have talked a little bit about the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College down at ASU and their Next Ed Workforce program, where we're rethinking how educators are working in different groups of educators for a larger numbers of students, where you have expertise develop. You might have a curriculum designer, an assessor, someone who's a specialist in reading, or whatever the case may be. But you have expertise areas and you're working in a much more collaborative environment. So the next education workforce model is something worth looking at if those listeners are trying to figure out, how do we retain teachers? How do we rethink our staffing models? So it's a lot there. I'm very curious what you think and your reaction to that, what you learned and what you've seen around as well.
Yeah, this is super, super interesting. One clarification on like the very first data point, just for my own understanding. So the 365,000 teachers who are not fully certified, is that just like within the whole landscape of the 3.2 million teachers, that's how many are uncertified? Or is this saying how many people are, and is that implying that there's a shortage of certified teachers, so they're having to go through like kind of by any means necessary to fill?
Yeah, I mean, almost always there is in any district, there's someone that's undercertified, and all states now have some sort of pathway to, like, either the district will say that you can get an emergency certification with the basics, or there's an accelerated pathway to move forward to get certification. So that 365,000 is they are putting people in classrooms that don't have the certification to teach in those classrooms. Now, to be really clear, is I don't think necessarily certification automatically makes a great teacher. And the private sector doesn't require certification. I've seen great teachers there. But it is a data point that people are tracking. So it's one that I figured was worth mentioning.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think all of this data is super helpful. It helps paint a picture that I think, one, like it is a challenge and a problem. Two, the solution of actually just getting more teachers in the door and retaining them is going to be a pretty hard, long systemic shift. I remember the first time when I was traveling abroad and like I bumped into someone from Germany who had just become a teacher, and they were like, I became a teacher because it's like one of the most well-paid and respected jobs in Germany. And I was like, that is that is baffling. Like that was really novel to me at that time. So I think that takes really big mindset shifts, which is just so hard to do at scale. So
Yeah.
this Mary Lou Fulton Teacher College approach of really rethinking the models themselves of how you inhabit a classroom and facilitate learning, my knee jerk is that is a more friction-free place to start. So I think we're bullish on that. I think we both are curious about how AI is going to show up in this space and what that's actually going to do for both the amount of people needed for the same old roles, or how that's going to pivot them. That's kind of what we've been thinking about with the Ed3DAO work as well. And I think I just saw a piece this morning that I'll put in the show notes about how Eastern Hancock is really leaning in on this like teacher autonomy and teacher voice place. So I do think that there are growing models of school districts that are doing that work of actually heavily incentivizing autonomy and voice. And that will just be really interesting to watch in parallel with some of these other trends we're seeing, like micro schools, where if a teacher is given enough like autonomy and agency, are they just sort of like, oh, I might just like start my own thing. Like, this is great. Like, what is
Right.
the thing at a certain point? What's the thing that keeps you within the system once you've been given this set of parameters versus what pushes you out and kind of gives you enough confidence to do your own thing? And I think
Yeah,
that's
and that's
interesting.
really an interesting question. Is that sort of there's that freedom and flexibility of, and let's imagine a homeschool facilitator, an educator who left the system and has a handful of homeschool students. It's great. You have ultimate agency and autonomy, and you have no support infrastructure or
Totally.
architecture behind you. So I think there's going to be this probably loosen. I would hope that you could address this retention issue with a loosening of structures where you have a little bit more autonomy and independence for educators, and probably just like we do for students, those who are ready. I don't think everybody's ready. I mean, we teach educators are taught in a compliance-based system, so we all learn in a compliance-based system, and then we are employed in a compliance-based system. So there has to be some sort of gradual release of control where you are moving more and more independent in your system, but there still has to be a benefit and a value of being part of the larger organization. And I think those are the great districts who have this really great culture and climate, have given autonomy and agency to educators, but also said, the reason you're working here is that we can create environments that are supportive, whatever the benefits package is, professional learning opportunities, all these things that are really great to be inside a larger organization rather than spinning off into your own satellite individual school, which is great in terms of autonomy, but really hard in terms of facilitation. So
I think just to tie back, because I didn't comment earlier on the public schools perception from the earlier prompt, I think this connects. I think this is partially it's a narrative shift problem. Like if we public schools, I think get a really bad rap in the press because of our like negativity bias that we've talked about before, where everybody shares a district's reading rates have fallen by 6% rather than highlighting the district whose reading rates have increased by 5%. It's like something is just going to always be, it's a little bit more like eye-opening if it's a negative news source. So how do we change that narrative shift around teachers? What does it look like to actually spotlight the teachers who have stuck around, who the system has, they've kind of made the system work for, and make that position something that's desirable?
yeah, I mean, and I think at Getting Smart, we're doing that all the time through our media
We're
work because we're
trying, yeah.
always trying to highlight stories of success, things that are working. And there are so many schools and districts and educators and leaders in those schools and districts that are doing really great, courageous work to help young people, all young people learn. And you're right, our negativity bias likes to catch the headlines that are saying schools are not good. And that then influences national polls who say, my local school's good, but generally in the United States, they're not good, right? That's very much a media influence piece. So thanks for circling back on that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think the biggest thing for listeners is if you're struggling with this is what's the data? So why are people leaving? How many are leaving? Especially in bigger districts where you have to get a handle on, it could be potentially thousands and thousands of teachers. What can you control? So what are the technical challenges? And some of those technical challenges might be we're going to create PLCs, or we're going to give a little bit more autonomy. And then what can you change, these adaptive challenges, which might be the next education workforce model, things that are second order change, things that actually break apart the structure that we've been used to for the last 150 years and change it to address educator attrition. So
Mm.
food for thought. All right, what's your deep dive? What's a deep dive you have, Mason?
Okay, bear with me on this one. This is returning to a few weeks ago when we talked about this idea of tribes and tribalism a little bit. kind of vaguely. It's also thinking a little bit about those junior republics we talked about.
Right.
But this is really this idea of individual identity and what does it mean at the cognitive level? And then how can we reframe what we think identity formation is? So this is identity in the sense of like what you value. I think just to put a definition on it, it's like if you're going to make this decision or this decision and you make decision A, sort of what in your identity made you choose that thing over the other one.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, like for you, just to start off, do you remember in some of the formative years, what got you into the things that you got into? I think whether that be like specific music, which is often my case, but also like soccer, surfing, these things that you love to do, like how did you find them?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think part of it was exposure. I had parents that were saying, "What do you want to do?" And part of that was musical. I started with playing the recorder in a church organization. Part of it was probably the people. So soccer, I remember some early soccer experiences. At least in high school, I had a coach that was she was she was an inspiring coach and someone who just made us work hard, but also it was that the first experience of high relationship, high expectations,
Hmm,
and probably the same for educators as well. Like the some of the teachers I had were high relationships, high expectations that got me into science and math, which was my background, which may have been different than the ones that were in humanities. It could have
yeah,
just as easily been humanities if that teacher was there as
totally.
well. So it feels like it is the personality of that person and then the context within which they intersect or interact with me. So there's a content piece,
For sure.
sports or music, and then almost always just going back to the individual, right? Because
To-
it seems like to me.
totally.
We went for joy and games and being on a team and just playing. We did a I had three brothers growing up, and all four of us were athletes, but also musicians, and we loved playing things. We were always playing, and our parents
Totally.
gave us a lot of free reign to play. So I think the idea of healthy competition and play was great. And soccer happened to be emerging at that time in Massachusetts, and so we jumped on and joined that. So there was it's almost like right time, right place that
Totally.
happened to be that. It could have been something totally different if there was an incredible drama program that was emerging and I was excited about that, that might have been something that I was involved in. So
Totally.
it just, yeah, it seems to be opportunistic and who's around you and what's happening to provide context.
Absolutely. And I think we've talked about this actually before. And actually, we never got the resulting photo from you. But eventually, soccer haircuts become like a way of telling the soccer story. Like you
That's
make
true.
these choices to keep self selecting back into the story that you've told
All
yourself,
right.
which is
I'm gonna get the soccer haircut picture I'll give you a college one and a high school one.
so I think that all of these kind of aesthetic choices, all these choices factor into the story you tell yourself about a choice that you have made that kind of keeps recalibrating you along that line. I am a soccer player and therefore I do this thing, not this thing. And I am a
Yeah.
soccer player. So the I just wanted to set that up for a little bit because it is messy and you've put your finger on this kind of extrinsic, intrinsic soup that we all live with
Yeah. Yeah.
choices. So every moment we do have these like external evaluation factors, these people in our lives, these kind of right time things in our lives. But inside and intrinsically in our brain, we have these two kind of big sciencey terms that I was just learning about. So you probably know more about some of the stuff than I do already. But the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is sort of in the frontal lobe, and this is a part of the brain that gets really activated when you have to make a choice between two things.
Mm.
And then the default mode network, which is basically like a lot of the synapses that sort of remember patterns over time of which one you've chosen. So these two parts in your brain that sort of light up when you are faced with making a value, and over time these values start to shape what that identity is. So just a really like an example of this would be like if you're presented with an apple and a Dorito, a bag of Doritos, and you have to choose which one you're going to eat. That's kind of like when this part of your brain lights up, and basically you have this kind of immediate taste pleasure memory of the Dorito. You may have these like long-term health goals of the apple, and it sort of starts to assigning these subjective values to each, and then you make a decision sort of based on decisions you made in the past, some of this external factoring that we've talked about. And some of the study has been done by a person named Elliot Berkman, who talks kind of about the science of like why going on a diet doesn't stick, but becoming someone who has a healthy lifestyle sticks. Like if you
Mm.
tell yourself that you are a healthy person and therefore you would not eat the Dorito, you are much more likely to choose the apple than if you were just to say, I'm actually not, I'm dieting right now. or I dieted before, and so I'm not going to choose this Dorito. So that's just like an example of this. And I think building on sort of the science of habits, which have really come into the fold with, I think, a lot of like productivity hacking in the last few years, which
Yeah.
I am guilty of sometimes and also a little wary of sometimes. But Elliot Berkman also puts his finger on this idea of planfulness, which is basically like if you are going to want to do something, you have to have the ability to craft a plan around how you're going to do it. So you have to decide to yourself if you want to be healthy, if that's your goal, like if you want to have a healthy lifestyle, you have to actually do the work of deciding what healthy means and start to make some of that mapping of like, that means choosing this instead of this to tell your brain to kind of make those decisions in the right moment. So a lot of this is sort of common sense, but I'm just sort of starting from the brain in order to take us to where I want to go next. But feel
Yeah.
free to
I mean,
reflect.
there is something interesting there that sparked for me is that exercise of creating of this planfulness connects with this deficit we've noticed in schools around how do you help young people and educators be better project managers. And
Totally.
this in this particular instance is a project manager for oneself, right? I want to be healthy. So what does that mean? And I think it just sparks for me is that we're making these decisions all the time, and the decisions will then lead to habits, which then habits will, help build the identity. I am something. So what are the things in schools that we can do to influence, help people understand that there is a process going on in our brain when we're making choices, and how do we plan for the choices we want to make? And that sort of context sets us up for what does learning look like in schools to help develop our brains in certain ways. So
Totally, totally. And I think honestly, a lot of this conversation was formed by the fact that so many of my friends were all in like a music world are really into the same bands that they were into in like high school and early college. Like you just know it's really hard to get outside of that bubble of like who you loved at that time. So the things that happened at that time felt really formative to me in a way that I kind of wanted to understand deeper. So this led me into this world of adolescence, which is like kind of a buzzword. It's also sort of a debated term. It's a lot of things. But I was listening to this conversation with Taylor Guthrie from Morgan State University. I'll drop a link to that podcast in the link. It goes way deeper than I am today.
yeah, yeah,
But he was really sitting with a lot of this identity formation work. And he was saying that in adolescence, so much of what's happening in the brain is you're taking all these choices you've been making in this broader default mode network. And over time, it's just pruning them down to be really focused on the things that you think are going to be valuable in your life. So like in high school, I thought that music was going to be really valuable in my life. And therefore, like I really trimmed out a lot of things that were not music related. Maybe that was basketball in eighth grade. Maybe that was knowing anything about most sports. Maybe that was like I started to trim a lot of stuff out in order to stay focused. And so there's I think that's really important because as educators, we kind of need to be thinking about like this pruning that's going on and like recognizing that some of this kind of fits into the pathways conversation we've been having, but
right.
it's like, how do you kind of hedge a bet against pruning at the same time as you're also acknowledging that someone is trying to sort of spotlight a thing that they care about? So then they young people tend to have a dopamine pattern that is always pushing them toward novelty and taking risks. So this
Right.
is part
I
of the
know that.
pruning structure, and we know this. And I think that there's some kind of conversation around like if you present them with healthy risks, then they'll take those risks, and if you don't present them with healthy risks, then they're going to find a different way to take a risk, right? You're going to go out and do something that is maybe challenging a law somewhere or challenging safety somewhere. The sort of the scholar and professor and anthropologist really kind of zooms in on the Prussian method as being this thing that really reduced the amount of risk that a person could take within this predefined adolescent period. So they're kind of saying like the idea was to really slow the transformation from childhood to adulthood into a number of years rather than a number of months or days, which tend to be the rite of passage for most like indigenous groups. And the goal was to create this permanent state of compliance. And so they used the same methods that they would use to like, break horses and other domestic animals. In his words, it's very provocative. It's a great book called Sand Talk. So
Okay.
I was just thinking about this idea of like the ways in which we've created this compliance infrastructure, which is working really heavily against the grain of what it means to present students with a lot of choice and risk, such that over time they can form identity.
Right.
And I do think that there's as the resulting factor of that might be kind of what we were talking about toward the beginning of this idea of sameness. Like if you're not creating these abilities for people to take risks a lot, you actually kind of create this homogenous idea of what it means to be successful or a person in this compliance world. And I think that we're all definitely wary of that because, especially at Getting Smart, we really value like diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of
Yeah.
background.
Yeah, I
Interesting.
mean, that's a really good question. I think that's a lot, really good neuroscience work there, and the idea of sort of your frontal cortex is slower to develop. Your amygdala, and as an adolescent, is driving the emotional reactions, and that causes more risk taking, and that's healthy. That's what's supposed to happen during that time, and it's trying to find the check on that so students, they don't go out and do something so dangerous that they're at risk
Totally.
of death or injury. But how do we tap into that is your fundamental question is how do we tap into this really interesting moment rather than pushing back against it? And, they have an interesting moment, like it's 0 to 5 is really interesting for childhood development. And
Yep.
then this adolescent period, two really important growth periods. So I do like the idea of how do you teach young people how to be courageous? I think that there's a lot of pressure to conform. I wonder what we would do in schools to do that, and I think that's probably pushing. I mean, I remember when we were doing a lot of project-based learning, we would have them pick up the telephone and call adults, and that was really challenging for a lot of students.
Hmm.
Or we would, in our particular setting, we would do experience trips, and so we would take them out of their comfort zone and do trips out into the woods and backpacking, and that would take people out of their comfort zone. So all of those are controlled risk-taking experiences that help brains make all sorts of decisions and practice making decisions around, in this case, safety if you're in the outdoors, or ability to act like skills that are worthwhile as an adult, making phone calls, etc. And so I think we need to put young people into these positions over and over again. In my own family, that's what we did. Is we just said, okay, it's time for your teeth to get clean. Guess what? You got to call the dentist, right? I mean, there are things that we do too much for young people, our own children or students, that enable them to not develop those skills that are more courageous, more risk-taking, et cetera. Doesn't mean they don't do other things that are risk-taking. They do. But if we
Totally.
want to mold that or push that into our education systems, we got to give them agency and then give them practice in those skills that take a little bit more courage and bravery and are a little bit more risky than the run-of-the-mill sitting and learning in a school every day.
Very, very succinct. And I think you highlighted like the key thing in this, which is basically that we tend to push away risk from young people in order to sort of preserve them, keep them safe, etc. And those are very important things to hold in tension with this idea that like that is also the core moment where they are forming so much of who they are, what they value, what they care about. And I think it's very possible to over index on either side. So I think as
Sure.
school leaders and experienced designers in a lot of cases, we just need to be holding that front and center as we're working with these groups of people.
Yeah, and you mentioned dopamine. I think that's the other really important consideration is that our brains, dopamine's the drug that our brain runs on. And when things release more dopamine, we are going to be more engaged and more willing to do it. And so much of a young person's life outside of school is filled with dopamine-rich experiences. And that may typically have been in extracurriculars, meaning, sports or drama or bands, where you were out, you were performing, there's a little bit of a risk. Now, more and more, unfortunately, it's dopamines through our scrolling and Instagram feeds. And we get these little squirts over and over again, designed really carefully by very smart people to keep us moving on this system,
Yeah.
these technology products. And so, as an educator and as schools, we need to think about how do we have the right amount of dopamine release that's allowing a student to want to learn more in that particular area, learn more on that particular project, et cetera. And so when we talk about difference making projects, there's some sort of release that's happening. Like, I care. I have a little squirt of dopamine. I'm going to go more into this. Or I'm interested in this because the teacher has given me a choice, a little bit more dopamine, a little bit more interest. And so we're combating this quick dopamine, quick satisfaction
Right.
world outside of schools with a system that is very dopamine deficient, I think, a traditional education system. So
Totally. Amazing. All right. Should we get into our human expression section for today?
what do you got for me?
All right. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I recently put out a book called Kestrel and Other Songs. It's like a poetry collection. It's fun to have a physical thing in the world against the trends of books not being as popular. But I had a friend call me who bought it and they were like, hey, I want to talk through some of the stuff in this that I liked. And I was like, oh, that's really sweet. Like, that's great. And then they just went page by page and talked about the thing that they liked about every page in this book, which I was like not at all expecting. I was just on a walk and I walked around for like 2 hours and it felt like such a generous gift for someone to do that. It was just like an expression of, I care about you. You made a thing that I resonated with and this was great. And it also really made me think about just how important the kind of metacognition is of identifying why you like something or why you don't. I think last week I slacked you about this when you sent me a song that you had been working on. I was like, oh, like what do you like about that song? And you were like, interesting. And I think we go through life so much getting these kind of like aesthetic responses that are really instant, which feel good. Like I think that there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think that if you actually reflect on why you like something, it gives you more language to find the things that you like again. And in a world where algorithms are doing that work for us, I just think it's really important to be able to have agency over your own kind of taste and curation. And as a skill, we're also hopefully trying to teach young people through a lot of this curation and evidence and metacognition work that we've been talking a lot about.
Yeah, no, I love that. And just being curious, right? Like
Totally.
you were curious about what someone thought about the book and they told you, and then that leads to in-depth discussion. And that's exercising those muscles that are really, really
Totally.
important. So I was at a restaurant the other day with my wife and father-in-law, and the waitress sat us really, really close to another. There was a lot of open tables, and they sat us really, really close to another couple that was seated. And I recognized that I had an aversion to that. I'm like, oh, that feels really close. I don't necessarily want this. And we didn't change it, and we sort of turned our backs. But then I was thinking about this podcast and human expression, and I came across this article on this program called Longer Tables, which is out of Colorado, and is a nonprofit that believes in the power of shared meals to connect people. And they welcomed over 3,000 locals who signed up to sit down at the first ever mile-long table. And so, and they had fresh food and from farms and gardens and things like that. But it was this idea that meals are a time to bring people together. And in our worlds, and this is not just this may be a US culture, maybe even a subset of US culture, because I know all cultures are different and families are different. But that idea of privacy while eating tends to reduce connection, increase connection maybe with those who you're eating with. But this idea of going into a random restaurant, I remember this in Germany a long, long time ago when I traveled. All the restaurants had long benches, and you just sat at a bench and you might talk to the person next to you who you have no idea who it is. And I think there's something powerful about that. And so it reminded me that if I'm preaching connection as an important thing, I need to not have an aversion when I sit close to someone at a restaurant that I don't know. So that's my theme. And I appreciate this Longer Tables nonprofit. What a good idea.
I love it. A mile-long table in the Mile High City. That is starting to make quite the graph. Yeah. Amazing. Well, let's jump quick into the music portion of the show. You prepared us a lovely tune, I'm sure.
Yep.
All right. I'm going to cue it up and play it now.
Stacking like bricks on my back, policies shifting, they're changing the track. One story's hot, the next one's cold. The classroom's chaos, the system's old. Hey, what did I miss in this educational abyss? Trying to catch up, trying to persist. 2 weeks late, but I'm here to relate. Education news moves at a breakneck rate. 2 weeks late, yeah, I'm trying to stay straight. Headlines flying, I'm dodging the weight. Hey, budget cuts, slicing, schools feeling the burn. New mandates dropping, no time.
That's pretty good.
So okay, genre of music. What do you got for me?
That feels very specifically like kind of the early aughts, like alternative hip hop. It kind of it starts to flirt with hip hop, but it still has kind of like that analog instrument palette.
It's not bad. So it's reggaeton was my cue, and then it was Bad Bunny. I've been reading about how Bad Bunny has changed the sort of temporal economics of Puerto Rico for the last little bit, because he's been doing all sorts of concerts over there. And so that was my cue, is Bad Bunny, reggaeton, and that's what I came up with. So
I see that the bump bump bump.
Yeah,
the beat has that a little bit more than the melody and the flow, but I love it. That's pretty fun. Is there a chorus in that song?
I think something about I like the idea of the data sitting like a rock on my back or something like that.
Nice. That's good. Yeah, I need to spend some time with the lyrics to really have
please do.
What I like about them and what I don't.
You can put them in your next poetry book.
Well, Nate, super good to see you as always, and enjoy the East Coast.
Yeah. Thanks, Mason. Good to catch up, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.